Okay, so welcome to our 64th edition of BC Open Discussion. And today we'll be talking about add how you can add item attributes to an item via code. And I don't remember who asked for it, but somebody actually asked it either on the last meeting or meeting before that. So we'll go through the understanding of how it works right now. And if you have a situation where you want to do add item attributes while creating item, how you can do that. So we'll go through that part. So let's go through the normals. Where do you register? If you are here for the first time and you don't want to register every week, then drop your name and email in the chat, and I'll make sure that you get invited in future meetings until you say that don't send me an invite. Otherwise, this link normally gets updated after this meeting or by max by tomorrow, and you can always go and register here. Okay, so what happened, what I found interesting last week. Jeremy, if you don't know him, he is an Microsoft MVP. He has this website called sparebrain.com, and he created a cool feed of info that you can subscribe to if you are busy. So what I have done is he have created some, I don't know exactly what feed it is, but let's go through that page. So if you're busy, because there are so many things that are changing, so many people who are writing about Business Central, and it gets a little tough to kind of focus on everything that's happening. So what I have done is on this page, you can go and register based on the kind of pattern you want. If you want the daily notification of Microsoft tweets from Microsoft staff, community majorly use tweet if you are not on Twitter, new blog posts from different MVPs and other community people, and also the YouTube video links. There is also the similar kind of information on a weekly format. So you can just subscribe here, and I guess then you go and enter your email ID, and that sends you something like this based on your frequency, daily, weekly, or whatever that is, right? If you find something, I guess he have also shared the source somewhere. If you think that there is some great blog or a YouTube channel which is missing, you can also request that. And let me see where I saw that. I think it was here somewhere. No, that's something else. But yeah, if you are on Twitter, just go to his page, Jeremy's page, and he's showing you how you can suggest great blogs that you think are missing on this, and he'll add it. And if there is a content that is not available, so you can just request it, and it'll get added into the upcoming ones. I did subscribe to it. It looks super cool. At least I try to cover most of the thing during my day, but as I'm saying, it gets harder and harder with so much content available on Business Central. So it's a great place to kind of get an email once in a week or daily to just identify what I want to read and then navigate to directly that article, video, or things like that. Okay. So I guess we talked about this part in Business Central 19, but I wanted to revisit this because we'll be kind of touching this as we go forward on for the today's demo. Item templates. Microsoft has changed it a little bit in release wave 2. There is a complete change in how templates used to work. Microsoft have also marked the old item template table as obsolete, and there is a new table called item template dot. This is used for now new templates, and we'll be touching this area a little bit. So I just wanted to clear this that this is change in Business Central 2021 release wave 2. It's super easy to add if you have custom field that you want to add template into the templates. That's also super easy with this release. So what we'll be doing today is we'll add a new table called attribute templates. Like we have item templates, we'll add a attribute templates, and then that page that we'll add can be accessed from the item template page. And then the code that we write is moreover during the new item creation, attributes will also be copied to item from attribute templates. Now let's talk about item attributes, what they are and how it works. So for this functionality in Business Central, or it was added in NAV 2018 or somewhere around that, there are two major tables. One is called as attribute and another is called as attribute value. There are some flexibility about what kind of attributes you define and what kind of values they support, but it's limited to a certain extent. Like there are different options of date, time attribute, text attribute, decimal attributes, integer attributes, and an option attribute. Now, other than option attribute, all other type of attribute are kind of more or less open. You can define any values for those, but for option there is specifically an attribute value. So before we move ahead, let's go into Business Central and see what I'm talking about, if this is still accessible. Okay. All right. So what happens is, and if you haven't used attributes, that's something I guess you would like to see. Okay, so on the item table or item page, you can see somewhere here, always hard time finding things, attributes. You can also filter by attribute and you can go into attributes, but let's go and open this. The attribute info is also available here, like this in the fact box, and then you can also define them per item. Like for this item, the three attributes define color, depth, and height, and you can define whatever the values that you want for those attributes. If you go more into it, as in into the masters more or less, you can create these different type of attributes, which is, let's see, the options are option, text, integer, decimal, and date. And if it's an option, then you also have to define the attribute values. Like if I click on this, I can see item attribute values, which are different options. And then you can also block certain attribute values, or you can block a specific attribute. In the same way, on a non-option type, you can't actually define an attribute value because that doesn't make any sense. From the front end, it looks a little bit simple how it would have implemented, but behind the scene, it kind of works the way dimension works. Both of these tables have a primary key of ID, which is an integer, nothing major. And anytime you add a new attribute or an attribute value, you get a new ID around it. So let's see how we can create that table. I guess I've already created it, and we'll go further into it, and how we can then extend the item template feature to include the attributes also. Okay, so let me see where my VS Code is. Okay, here it is. And at the end or in the middle, if you think it is important, let me know. I'll commit it to Git. Otherwise, I'll just delete it after this demo. Okay. So what I've already done is I have created a attribute template table. Let me come out here, zoom this out a little bit. Okay. Now what's happening on this table is I have defined the item template code based on which this will be linked to item template. And then I've also defined the line number because a template can have multiple attributes. And both of these are part of primary key. Then I've also defined an attribute name, which is right now set as a flow field, and we'll go into further into it. And then an item attribute value, which is also a text. The primary key, as I said, is template code and line number. And then when the record gets inserted, the line number gets increased based on the template that it is part of. Supporting this, there is a page which is used at the item template level to add new attributes. And then that page is added into the item template list as well as on item template card. I think so far so good. If it's confusing at any point, let me know, but let's move ahead. Let's go to the table. Now, as I said, every attribute that we have in the system can be uniquely identified based on the ID that it attached to it. It is not defined by the value because that's how it is, right? So what we'll try to do here is when we have to fetch, the idea is to fetch the name of attribute into this template and then later use that data to insert into the item record when it is being created. So I'll need the attribute ID so that I can use it later. So let's do a new field here in the middle of it and name it as attribute ID integer. Okay, and now let's go ahead and copy some values from here. Okay, attribute ID, and then let's set a table relation to this with item attributes, and let's not allow people to select which are blocked. Oh yeah. But if I try try to add attribute ID in the front end for user, it'll be hard to kind of see that data and filter out that data. So we'll still only display the attribute name so that people can see it and then people can pick it when they want it. So now we have the attribute ID here. So what we can do is we can say that get the name of the attribute where the ID of the attribute is defined by my field attribute ID. So it'll kind of filter that lookup, filter that calc formula to calculate it. Now let's try to fetch the attribute ID from that. So when user looks up on attribute name, that's the area that we want to customize a little bit or change a little bit. Let's use a trigger and let's try to fetch the item attributes here. Record item attributes. Okay. Did I mistype it? Oh, maybe it's not used. Okay, unused. Okay. Now if I have to do lookup, I need to know the lookup page ID of this. So let's go and see the lookup page ID is item attributes. Okay, that's easy. Item attributes page, item attribute. Now what I want to do is on this page of item attributes, I'll just set the lookup mode, just set to true. And then on the record, I'll again filter it for not blocked. And then on the page, let's do a table view of the table. And then if I'm able to run that page as okay, I'll have to get the attribute ID. So I'll have to do a get. And let's put it value back into the item attribute. And then let's validate my attribute ID with item attribute dot ID. Okay. With this, if I'm not wrong, I should be able to fetch the ID when user selects the attribute name on the attribute template master. So with this, I'll get the attribute ID, and that's the way I'll be able to utilize this attribute while the item is being created. So let's first test this, and then we'll come into the attribute value part. Let me just publish this. And we'll go in my business central. Okay. Okay. And let's go into item templates. So as I've already done here, there should be an option somewhere, attributes, and I can, okay, I can do a lookup here. Okay, that gives me all the item attributes, and let's pick the width. Oh, I'll have to change some code somewhere so that it gets refreshed, but let's see, did I get the attribute ID or not? Because that's important. I got the attribute ID as 3. So now I'm safe enough that if I have to reuse this somewhere later in, well, moving it to the item, I can use it because I have the attribute ID attached to it. So that's good. Now let's see about the attribute value because that ties to the attribute which is already selected. So once we have done that, we have fetched the item attribute. Let's go and try to stop this debugger and go into our, let's collapse this. So we have fetched the atom attribute ID. Now let's do the similar kind of thing for attribute value ID. I'll just copy it here and I'll change the number. And this is my attribute value ID. Attribute value ID. And this comes from atom attribute value, where blocked again is false. And now I want to do the similar thing on our item attribute name. So let's see, I might have a code segment somewhere for that. So, okay, where is my notepad? Okay, here it is. So on my item attribute value, let's me write it as this. Okay. So what I'm trying to do is the similar thing. A record of item attribute value, the lookup page, whatever set on that table, setting the similar kind of thing, and adding one more filter of filtering that ID based on whatever the attribute is selected, and then fetching the attribute value ID and attribute value name. So now I should be able to select the attribute value also when I try to publish this. Let's do that quickly. And let's see that. Okay, template. I get into this is width, and this shows me whatever the values that is being used till now in the system for the width attribute. But as I said, it can be a fixed text field and anybody can type anything. So I can actually type 100 here. But we haven't done anything to handle a situation where somebody types it manually. If I type it manually like this, and then it, it kind of need to validate that data, that is it correct type, like can I type here my name? And if yes, that's not correct because it's width, and width is defined as decimal. So I'll have kind of to do some kind of validation so that it only supports the valid values into the attribute value text box that I just added into that page. So now let's come here and let's think about it, which is we have done the lookup, it's working, but I also want to do a validate of my attribute value.
You can definitely use table, table relation, validate, and set it to true.
Yeah, but that value is actually uh, not a value that is tied to this, right?
But I want to just validate the relation between the two tables.
Yeah, but if you look in the item attribute value table, the value field is actually text, so it'll allow anything. Even if I do a validate, the value field is a text type field, so it doesn't matter what you do over there. And then what item attribute feature is doing is, if you see these three fields, numeric value, date value, two fields, based on these two fields, it is trying to identify that is it the right value or not. That's how the logic is written to.
Well, okay, just to make sure, we're talking about the same attribute, is, if you will, is validate table relation, and you set that to true. It should work, whether it's a text or an integer, it would work.
No, because look, so let me re-explain you what I'm trying to say.
Okay, go on.
The attribute value that we are trying to save, right, on this field is of type text 250, right? The values that are stored in the item attribute values are not predefined values other than the option field. Okay, they are not predefined in this table because it's a text type of field. Either it, so let's say if you have an item where you are using a attribute of height. Now one item can have height of, let's say, 5 centimeter. The other one can have an attribute value of 10 centimeter, right? So these are not fixed value. These are the value that keep on changing based on different item, and it's a fixed text. The only validation that we needed is the value that we are entering, is it of right type or not? Does that make sense, Sam?
It does, yeah.
And because it's a custom table, so we need to make sure that we are doing things in the correct order so that it doesn't overlap or breaks the Microsoft base logic. As in, it will not, because it's on a separate table. So what we'll try to do is we'll try to validate this attribute value whenever the user types it. So let's add a trigger of my validate. Now in the validate, okay, let's remove this unused code. And if my attribute value is if my attribute value is not equal to the previous value of attribute value, or if it is equal, then do nothing. I don't want to call all my code if it is equal. Okay. Now, if because there is one type of field where the manual input is allowed or not allowed, which is an option field. So let's validate that part is the manual value allowed. If this is allowed, if this is not allowed, then let's check, is this a valid value? If it is not a valid value, then let's throw an error message. Attribute and the attribute name. So let's define these two methods, manual value allowed and then the valid value. So now we have two procedures, one for validating that is it allowing a manual value or not, and that we will define from item attributes, because attribute defines that what type of value it will support. Okay, so if your item attribute that you have already selected, oh, what's the primary key of this? ID. I should not do set range. In that case, I should do a get. Okay. Get. Okay. If it gets it, and if my item attribute type is equal to option, because that's only have the values, then I'll exit false. Otherwise, I'll exit default, which is true, not default, but it was not default. So this will return this. This will validate is it a type of option or not, because that's the manual value allowed tick will set. And then if it is not a manual value allowed, then we need to validate the values that user is entering, which we will do based on here. So need a value. Okay. Item attribute value. And then let's do an item attribute value dot get based on the current attribute ID. And but I can't do a get because it's a primary key of attribute ID and ID. Okay. So let's do a set range of my attribute ID with my current attribute ID. And then let's do one more, which is, oh, I have the attribute from where I'm calling this. I'm getting a little bit confused. I'm calling it from attribute value, which in turn will already have the attribute value ID, because this lookup will fetch that value here. Okay, so I can actually do a get. Okay. Track attribute ID and then attribute value ID. So if I get an attribute which it is supporting, then I also, in that case, I need to find that particular value is a valid value or not. So if item attribute value dot value is equal to rect dot attribute value, then exit true. Okay. If I find the attribute value over there and its value matches to the attribute value, then it exits true, otherwise it exits false. So with this, I'll be able to validate the value that user have entered. And if the validate fails, then it will give me an error message that it is an invalid value. But if the manual validation is not allowed, which means if it is, if it is an option, not an option field, then I also need to add a new attribute. Do I? Let me just check it. I'm maybe getting a little bit confused on this. Okay, item add, template. There's no error on this, which is wrong, I think. Let me see again what we did. We said on the validate of the attribute value, if manual value is allowed, which should be allowed in this case, and if it is not a valid value, then do an error message. If it is not a valid value, if it is not a valid value, where we did a get based on that attribute, but I don't have, oh, I don't have it yet. Oh, sorry, I can't do a get. Let me change this. Attribute value ID, and then let's do one more of my value with my attribute value. If item attribute is empty, then is it false or is it true? Okay, and let's save this. Okay. Templates. Still did save it. Okay, let me think about it. Oh, because there is no ID yet. That's the catch. So there is no ID on this. So that's why it's not picking up that value. Okay. So we have on the lookup of this, we have fetched the attribute ID, but we are not doing a lookup. So because we are manually typing it, and I'm manually typing the value allowed and it doesn't. So okay, I'll actually have to do another case here, which is the else of it. Okay, in this case where the manual value is allowed, which means where you can type a value like on decimals, integer and text, we should try to add that new value as an attribute. And then we'll fetch the ID from this, from that new record, and assign it to our method, sorry, our variable, so that we can use it. Which will happen from item attribute. Okay. So first let's check that do we have the valid item attribute selected, as in if somebody clicks on it directly, then what happens? If we don't find an attribute ID yet, there's no point of moving ahead. But if we find one, then we have to do an item attribute value creation. So let's pick it up from here and let's do an neat insert of it. Okay. Now, when we are trying to add the item attributes, we need to see how the ID is being generated. So the ID is set to be auto increment. That means we don't have to assign any value to it. It'll automatically get assigned. And we have to define the attribute ID based on whatever the attribute is already selected. Okay. Item attribute dot ID. The second is the value, which comes from whatever the user input is. Attribute value. Now, as I said, if you look into this table, there are two more fields, numeric and date, because the value have its own options. It's an option field. The value on the item attribute table, there is an option field called type, and that defines which type of attribute it is. So we'll have to do a case of that and then fill in these variable, which is case item attribute dot type. What type of attribute it is, that we'll have to define here. And then, as I said, there are different types. So let's pick those types. Date, decimal, integer. Option already have a value, so that doesn't fall into grab, as in there is already a value defined for it. Decimal and integer falls into the same type, and the date falls into it, and text is just a free text, right? So I don't have to worry about the text part. Okay. So if it is date, then what I have to do is I have to evaluate the item attributes value dot date value with whatever is being typed by the user at that time. which is our the value that is being generated right now, which is we have assigned it to item attribute dot value. So let's do that. So if this value validates, evaluates to this, that means it's a date value. And on the similar line, we can just copy this and paste it here. This time it is numeric value. So if the evaluate validates it, then it'll get added into it. And then we can do an insert here. If I do a case close here. Once this ID is inserted, then I need to take that ID, which comes out of this insert parameter, and assign it to my value ID, item attribute value .id. This will give me that ID for adding a new attribute. So let's quickly have a look on this. Item templates. Okay, attributes. If I type 1, 2, 3, okay. And let me see, did I get the ID or not? So 3 and 58. So I'm getting that. Now what happens if I try my name here? Oh, that seems an error message, which is during the evaluate, I guess. Let's see. Yes, this value cannot be evaluated to the decimal, which makes sense. So let's change that, which is we'll do an if not evaluate, then let's put an error message instead of trying to enter that value into the system. Let's say this as invalid value attribute requires a this type value, and then let's assign it whatever we need, which is item attribute dot name and item attribute dot type, which is similar for the other one also, for the decimal part, if not. All right. Now this is not considered as the best one, so let me just convert this to a label and name it as invalid input. Why this didn't convert to this? Okay. Okay. LBL, and then it will need okay, I can do that later. Okay. So this, it should stop the insert and it should warn the user that the value that you're typing is incorrect, and this attribute requires this type of value. So let's publish this, and we'll see it here into my item templates. Okay. And stop the debugger and let's go into attributes and let's try to type my name here. This time in invalid input attribute width requires a decimal value. Okay, so that seems correct. So now we have the ID based on whatever user enters into that field. when they are trying to validate the data on that field. So far so good. Any questions? Okay, so let's go back into our code and let me collapse these. Okay, so we have validated the value here, otherwise the new value is created and then we return it. But what if somebody clears that field? There's a chance that I go in and there was a value 1, 2, 3 and I just change it to blank. Just for those situations, I'll just add one more condition, that if the attribute value is turned back to blank, then don't proceed ahead. That's the sorry, don't proceed ahead. And also my attribute value ID should return to 0 so that I can use it later if required. Otherwise, let me validate this. If there are other codes that I've written, they might fail otherwise. Okay. So that handles that part, which is generating that attribute value, which we are trying to do. And then let's go up and see what we have done on attribute value ID. Okay, so okay, we didn't write a attribute. We have the attribute ID, we have the attribute name, and we have the attribute value. So we have everything more or less. Okay, so now let's go ahead and try to add this into the routine when the items get created based on the item template that we have, which is more or less subscribing to an event. But let's find out that event first. Okay, this is my AL package base app, and let me look for the item table, and there should be a reference to item template. Okay. There's something, create new item based on item template management, insert from template. Okay. It calls this method on insert of item from template, which is an event. Now this event is subscribed in the same code unit of result of create item from template. Okay, so here all that happens. So if you notice here, what's happening in the new implementation of item template is it initialize the item and then it initialize the number, because now in the template you can define the number series also, and then it just inserts the item. After the insert is done, it applies item template into it, which is pretty nice to have a look on it. Apply template, here it is, apply template, and then it assigns the dimension. So if you look at this code, what Microsoft is doing here is from I is equals to 3, which means, other than, let's see what is 1 and 2. 1 is the number field and 2 is the number 2 field. So from I is equals to 3, then to the field count which is available in the item template, it checks that does this require to be, is it marked as excluded or not. Otherwise it assigns all the values from template to the actual item creation. And that's why when we are talking about it as what change into it, any field now that is defined into the item template will get its value. And there are so many fields. If you want to have a look on that table, go ahead someday and have a look. It have all the value and it assigns all of them. So why we are here is to find this event, because after this the modify happens. So this is our event, and we'll subscribe to this event using a code unit. Okay. And let me call this as item attribute template management. And I don't have a code table for this, but this is what it is. Okay, let me just correct the name. Okay. So now what I want to do is just subscribe to that event which you just saw. So let's use the template of the event sub. And then I'm going to subscribe to this item template management. Okay. And then we have already copied the event. Yes. There's no element to this, and you should not skip if the license is not there, or you should not skip if the permission is not there and generate an error message. Now let's change the method name as add item attributes. The parameters available are item and item template, which I need both of them. Now in this, what I'll have to do just is make sure that I have my table record mapped, which is item attribute template that we have created. Item attribute template. Okay. And then item attribute value. So let's talk about that in a bit. Okay. So what we want to do is we want to read all the records which are available on that particular template, all the attribute record which are available in that template, and assign it to the item record. So we can do the item template code with whatever is coming from the item template. Okay. Once we find this, and we may or may not find multiple record based on whatever it is, we can run our custom code to item attribute template dot next is equals to 0. Okay. And now what just I have to do is I have to add the record into the item. Now there is a third table which stores the attribute, value, and item mapping, and that table is, let's see, ABC record item attribute value mapping. This table stores the record of the relationship between item attribute and attribute value. So this becomes my item attribute value mapping. Now let's have a look on this table. It has table ID, which means for which table this mapping is for. What is that unique or the primary key on that, which is item number. Then what is the ID of attribute, and what is the ID of the value, attribute value, and that's it. So we just have to do an insert into this table. So what we need is table ID, which will be our database item, and then we'll have the number, which is the primary key here of item dot number that we are getting already. As we have seen that it already gets inserted till then. Then we have the item attribute ID, which comes from my item attribute template dot attribute ID, and then it's item attribute value ID, which also comes from template dot attribute value ID. Now with this, all the attributes which are mapped to that template will also get added when you add a new item. So let's publish this and see this in action, just to get clarity on this. Okay. So now what we are going to do is we will go into our item attribute, sorry, in templates, and define attributes into it. Let's say width is 123 centimeter, and then due date is today, and then color is red. What happened? It's pretty good. Okay. Why the red is not a valid value? Okay, let me choose. Is it red? Oh, maybe it's case sensitive thing. Okay, and then let's choose model year as 2021. So on my item template called item, I have already attached 1, 2, 3, 4 attributes. Let's try to create a new item based on this template. Items. When I try to create a new item, I get the list of all the templates that I have in the system. I can choose that template, click on it, define it a name. Let's say discussion. And all my attributes should be available. Let me go down. Okay, here they are. I have the color, I have the width, I have the model year, and I have the due date. So I don't know what who asked it, I forgot now. Somebody did, and with this, I guess it's easier to do it from, and I don't know what that scenario was, but now here I can define different attributes, and then they will get attached to the item that's being added. And Sam, you're saying something? Sorry.
No, I'm not saying anything.
Okay. There is one problem that I just thought of, which is what if uh, what if somebody adds two attributes with the same name, because the primary key of this table is not supposed to handle those situations. If somebody adds two attributes with the same name in the current system at this point, I'm sure I can add two widths, because the primary key of this table is the category code and the number is being generated at the runtime. So it's possible that people can add two attributes with the same name.
I'm not sure I get the problem. Do you mean like adding on the same field, like on the page, using a pipe and adding the second?
No, I'm saying here I can also add one more width.
Oh, right, duplicate. Okay.
And that will cause problem, because then which one value should be selected, right? That should not be. And the way I think I can handle it is here, when the attribute ID is generated. Yeah, let's complete this so that whosoever asks for it can again have a look on it and use it if required. So when the attribute ID gets validated, I just need to check that is it being repeated or is that multiple instance of it or not. If there are multiple instances, then it should generate an error message. Attribute template, which is the current record. Template, okay. And then based on the template, I just need to do a set range on my item template code, which is my rec.item template code, and then this, sorry, template. I also need to do an attribute ID with attribute ID. If my item attribute template set okay. If my item attribute template dot count, if it is greater than attribute ID is not yet inserted, but it's greater than 1, then I need to generate an error message, which is item attribute %1 already exists based on item. I don't have an item attribute here. What do I have? Item attribute template dot attribute name. But name is a flow field, so I need to do a calc field of this before I use it. Somewhere here. So let's do a calc fields. Or do a set auto calc field. Okay. So I hope this will eliminate that problem that I was thinking about. Go back and stop the debugger. Okay. Let's go last time into item templates. Attributes, if I try to add the width again. Well, item attribute already exists, so that means it will not allow me to repeat anything that I have already done.
Well, it would be convenient if it could check both the combination of the attribute name and the value. If width with 1 to 3 is already keyed in, not just the same attribute name. It needs to be the combination, you say?
I get what you're saying, Sam, but the only thing is that when I go into items here, I can have an attribute one time. So, and I think that's how it is. Let me just check. Can I add another color? No, I cannot. Yeah. So I cannot have same attribute twice for an item.
Okay.
So, the same rule applies on the template, that if there will be multiple, then it kind of cause problems over there. Okay. I guess we ran out of time, but yeah, I don't know who asked this, but this was the idea for today that we're talking about. And if this makes sense, maybe I'll put it on my GitHub. Otherwise, I'll just delete it. You guys tell me. Okay, any thoughts about the next week? Anything that...
Are we done with interfaces? We've covered it, actually.
We did cover it, but let me think about the scenario which I can, but maybe not next week because I'm traveling this week. I'll just come back exactly on Saturday. Okay, so maybe for next week, on 27th, we can talk about it. I'll think about it.
Somebody's raising the hand.
Sorry?
Somebody's raising the hand.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, Dashrath, yeah. Hey, Dashrath, you're saying something?
His microphone is actually
Yes.
muted.
Hello, sir. I
Yeah, I
sent
can hear you. Yeah, I can hear you.
one sent regarding singleton pattern in BC or Neo. I did not about him. Please explain.
Which one, sir?
Singleton pattern.
I mean, it's the singleton pattern.
Yeah.
Singleton pattern.
Yes.
Can
I
you send me
hear.
some?
No,
Sorry?
I have no idea about that. I hear in my office related interview question, so I thought share with you.
Singleton pattern. And Sam, do you know anything about it? Singleton or anybody else?
The no issue. We'll discuss on next session.
Yeah, let me. I haven't heard it but I'm searching for it. But when I do that, it seems something is there. Let me come bring it here.
There's
Singleton.
actually a repo, Sarav, for
Okay.
singleton. Yeah. There's the repo available on the chat.
Okay, that's it. Let me go through it. And
Actually,
Sam, can you
yeah,
send me the repo? And
yeah,
I'll
it's on the chat. It's actually maintained by Brummel. I'm sure you've heard about him.
Oh yeah,
Mark
maybe I have seen that. Yeah, I'll have to
is
see.
actually famous with his wife or something on LinkedIn. They're doing a pretty good job, really.
Yeah. Okay, that sounds good. That's something new to learn, which is good. Thanks,
Yeah,
Dashrath. I'll surely go through it.
okay,
Go
okay.
ahead.
Thank you.
You're saying something?
No, no, just hear the new thing I thought share with us.
Yeah, I have heard about it in NAV, and I didn't know that Mark and others are working on it in AL, which seems pretty good.
I was sent mail, but a little bit late, so you not read that.
Yeah, I haven't read it yet. Maybe you would have
Yeah,
sent it.
because I sent today.
Oh, okay.
No issue. We'll discuss next session.
Okay, not a problem.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so if anyone else have any thoughts, you can, and you are not sure yet, you can just drop me an email. If that's something we can discuss next week, great. Otherwise, we'll just chit chat next week. Talk about something that we learned
So
that week or
that
so.
would,
Yeah,
that would be a upcoming open discussion next Saturday.
yeah,
Okay.
an open discussion.
Yeah. Wow. It's his name, really.
Right. Okay.
Again,
Sounds
thank you,
good.
Sarav. It was
Thanks.
informative as usual.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks. Thanks, Ed.
Thanks, Gaurav.
Thanks, man.
Thank you.
Thanks.